Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 51 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Colorado Avalanche, in which the Sharks have lost 4-3. So at the very least, it was a closer game on the scoreboard than the previous one yesterday was, where the Sharks dropped 3-0 to the Avalanche squad, but it wasn't necessarily all that much closer in terms of actual play in this game. In the first period, the ice was somewhat tilted in favor of the Colorado Avalanche, though the Sharks, I would say, did a decent job at nullifying what Colorado could do. The Avalanche had a couple of good chances for themselves, though couldn't convert. The Sharks not really with too much themselves, and as such it was a 0-0 score at the end of the first period. However, come second period, the Avalanche really started to take over. They were pouring chances after chances, and yet the Sharks actually scored a goal early in the second period and held a 1-0 lead for a decent while off of Abara Banov's power play goal to end the power play drought for the San Jose Sharks. However, it would come with about 7-8 minutes left in the second period where the Sharks would get a power play, but then about 15 seconds into the power play, the ref would realize their mistake of giving the Sharks a power play and would call a phantom penalty on Brent Burns for interference, and we'd head to 4-on-4, when with the much more open ice, the Avalanche, with their immense speed and skill, were able to take advantage with a beautiful passing play, which is seemingly what it would take to finally break through on Khanishov, who was having a great game for himself, and McKinnon would score to tie it up at 1. The Avalanche would soon follow up with a Burakovsky goal to make it 2-1, and that would be the score at the end of the second period. In the third period, the Avalanche would continue to just pour on the pressure. They'd get a goal from Patrick Nemeth to make it 3-1. The Sharks would actually respond with a short-handed goal from Logan Couture that would get reviewed for goaltender interference as it was challenged, but this time this goal would stand, 3-2 Colorado at this point. However, a few minutes later, Rantanen would score to make it 4-2. The Sharks would get one back from Tomas Hertl on the 6-on-5, so the Sharks' 3 goals in tonight's game were power play, shorthanded, and 6-on-5 advantage, none at even strength. But however, even with that one and a couple minutes left, the Sharks could not complete the comeback, and they would lose 4-3. And first thing to talk about would be Khanishov. As I said, a fantastic game for himself. Just looked about as good as you could possibly look in a game where you still let in 4 goals. And what's actually kind of funny about this one is that the Sharks were facing off against former Sharks goaltender Devan Dubnyk. It was just a few weeks ago where Dubnyk was the second string goaltender for the San Jose Sharks. I guess you could call him that at the time. And Khanishov was the third string, and now Khanishov has moved up to second string because Dubnyk was indeed traded to this Avalanche team. And we see the matchup here tonight, and you could just go to show how much easier it is to be a goaltender for an elite defensive team, or just an elite team in general with very good defense like the Colorado Avalanche, compared to a not so elite team and a not so elite defensive team like the San Jose Sharks, because I would say there is zero argument where you could make that Khanishov did not look significantly better than Devan Dubnyk, or at least didn't have to play significantly better than Devan Dubnyk, and yet Dubnyk was victorious in this one, even with the 3 goals let in compared to the 4. Because Khanishov made save after save, beautiful saves at the end of the second period, made a couple of insane ones on Landeskog and Rantanen, a beautiful save as well in the third period, and it was just a crazy game, and yet by the end of it, it's 4 goals let in, and it's hard to necessarily put too much blame on him for either, or for any of them. I would say if there's one thing to talk about, Khanishov maybe needs to do a bit of a better job at finding these pucks through traffic, because it seemed as though once there were a few players in front of him, he found himself guessing a bit, and he would lean the incorrect way. For instance, on this Patrick Nemeth goal, he ends up sliding in the complete wrong direction from where the puck is going, because he couldn't seem to locate it past the big group of players in front of the net. So that would be a small flaw to his game, absolutely, but it's hard to really find much after a beautiful performance here tonight. He was the only reason the Sharks did not lose this game, let's say 8-3, if we're being honest. Next, I will be talking about Abara Banov, as he once again, with a very solid game for the San Jose Sharks. He's been very good for them ever since he was brought into the lineup just a few games ago after having been traded from the Toronto Maple Leafs, and he gets the power play goal here tonight. He has a nice play to get this one to Brent Burns, which eventually leads to the Tomas Hertl goal here tonight. He had a very nice play on one of the Sharks power plays as well in the third period that could have resulted in a goal. It was a very nice pass to Brent Burns that Burns just couldn't handle, as it was maybe a bit too hard. But just in general, Abara Banov looking like he's been setting up a lot of nice plays. He's really clicking with the team, and you could tell that Booner really respects that, because not only has he managed to retain this spot on the second line, which is difficult for some of these newer and younger players to do with Booner's regime that he runs in San Jose, but also when the Sharks when the Sharks needed that goal to tie it up, who did they send on in those last 3 minutes? Well, obviously the usual suspects, Burns, Karlsson, Kane, but Abara Banov was with them in that regard, which I would say is a pretty big compliment from the coach. So as I've already pointed out in a previous review, I do hope that Abara Banov stays with the San Jose Sharks. I believe I saw a story earlier, maybe a few days ago, where the Abara Banov's agent implied that he really wanted to come to San Jose because he thought he would be able to get an opportunity, and that's exactly what has happened here. So hopefully the agent follows that same logic in the offseason and decides to re-sign with the Sharks, because I do suspect that the Sharks will definitely try and re-sign him. Next, I will be talking about Nikolai Khanishov. As it wasn't necessarily a standout game for him, though I do think it was a very strong game. But as I've already mentioned many, many times before in the past few reviews, I want to talk about more looking forward into the future for a lot of these Sharks players, instead of focusing on players who specifically, had a bad game or anything like that. Otherwise, it would be kind of negative going down the stretch here, considering we might have a few bad games, especially considering the fact that the Sharks will be facing off again against the Colorado Avalanche over the next couple of games, as well as the Golden Knights game for the final one of the season. So talking about Khanishov, I must say he has progressed very, very well this season. As I've already pointed out many times in the past, he has been a bit of a surprise, but also, like I said with Abara Banov, the biggest compliment that Khanishov has really received this season is the fact that he's managed to maintain this spot on the Sharks' second pairing with Erik Karlsson for so long, because I said Booner is a coach who, when it comes to these younger players, is quite quick, definitely, to demote them and to drop them in the lineup. We've seen it happen a lot of the time with a lot of the Sharks forwards, and while the Sharks don't necessarily have too many great choices to replace Khanishov on that second unit, it would never have surprised me to see someone like Vlasic move up with Karlsson, or see someone like Radim Shemek move up with Karlsson, but instead Khanishov managed to maintain that spot, even though I at one point said that it might be smart to drop him back to the third pairing after he didn't look too good for a stretch of a few games, but Booner gave him the time. Khanishov found his game back, and he's looked like a very solid defenseman for the San Jose Sharks. Karlsson has been extremely inconsistent this season. Brent Burns has been extremely inconsistent this season. And so maybe besides Mario Ferraro, who has had some really nice moments and has looked at least a bit more consistent than those previous two mentioned defensemen, Khanishov has maybe been one of the more consistent defensemen for the San Jose Sharks this season, which is a lot to say on a team with the names that they do have, and even if those names, maybe aren't as big names as they were in the past. And finally, I will talk about Ryan Donato once more. I mentioned him in the previous game, and I'm going to bring him up here again tonight, and I'm going to bring him up for the following game, and the game after that, and the game after that, until he finally actually gets the recognition he deserves from Bob Booner, because it continues to mystify me how Donato manages to maintain a spot on the fourth line. I believe he had the least amount of time on ice out of any Sharks player in this game by the end of it, which is just kind of crazy to me. So Chekovich came out of the lineup. There were no new faces for the San Jose Sharks in tonight's game. I was somewhat surprised by that, I would say. And so Chekovich was moved off, and that left an empty spot on the first line. So who's going to move up? Is it Ryan Donato? It probably should be, considering. However, not this time, as it was Noah Gregor. And don't get me wrong, I really do like Noah Gregor as a player. I think he can be a solid fourth liner, maybe even third liner in the future for the San Jose Sharks. But first liner, not so much. And yet Ryan Donato, while he obviously can't be a first liner, I would say he has more offensive capabilities than Noah Gregor does. But for whatever reason, he seems to have the ball and chain locked. He is completely locked into that fourth line. I don't know why. And as I said, I will mention it here tonight, and I may even continue to mention it going into further reviews, because it is a crazy phenomenon that I am witnessing. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Monday, where they will take on the Colorado Avalanche once more. This was actually their final road game of the season, as they will finish off the season with 4 straight games at home. And we'll see if maybe there can be some bigger and bigger crowds in San Jose as restrictions ease a bit, and we'll see if the Sharks can actually deliver that bigger home crowd, a nice win to be a bit of a feel-good end to the Sharks season as they approach these final 5 games. Class dismissed.